Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Frank Losello. I'd like to give you a very brief introduction. First of all, I'm a proud member of the American College of Prosthodontists and have had truly the honor of being a director of a prosthodontic residency program during most of my career. Um, I've been involved in dental education pretty much in some capacity as a program director, as I said, a professor at the school, and in research and development at Ivoclar Vivadent. So I've had kind of a variety of opportunities. Um, in particular, in removable prosthodontics has been my primary interest. Therefore, I'm obviously very excited about the opportunity to share some information regarding digital denture technology. So it's the latest and the greatest. And I certainly would like to thank everybody for joining in this evening. And I certainly hope I'm able to share this enthusiasm with you and get you excited about transitioning into this new area of dentistry. So let me just check the first box here. Okay. The title is The Pathway to Transition Toward Digital Dentures. And I chose this particular title very carefully because it is a transition. And I would like to regard that probably most of you or many of you are certainly in the same capacity that I am, in that we've been trained in a traditional removable prosthodontics. And this new technology, it's new. And it does perhaps need some clarification, and somebody hopefully who has gone through the pathway is able to avoid some of the stumbling blocks that you might encounter. So anyway, I let's take our start with this transition, and I've proposed this particular outline. I think it's a good flow. And we're going to do it in two different parts. And the part one is today, and we're going to do the technical and clinical advantages and discuss them. And then spend some time on clinical workflows, which I think is extremely important to try to transfer that information to you. Part two would be next week, which I hope you come back for. And there we're going to emphasize the prescription, which will include the manufacturing processes, the tooth selection, some communication tools, and a particular prescription form. And certainly the clinical try-in, which I think is probably going to be the most challenging in a sense of being different into this particular process, and takes a little different mindset for that particular appointment. So we'll spend some focus on that particular appointment, and obviously the insertion is the bottom line. So let's start with our technical advantages. Now, I think the question certainly is, could we make a better denture, and that's the obvious question, and I think it's a good one to ask, and I think the things that we look at is the accuracy of the process. Is it the how does it compare to the traditional fabrication of dentures? And it's remarkably different. Polymethyl methacrylate is a fantastic material when we process it in the dental laboratory, however, depending on the processing systems, but it can lead up to like a 7% of volumetric inaccuracy, which is rather large. What you'll find with this new technology, especially with the milling technology, that the accuracy, it's virtually 100% accurate. So there really is no manufacturing distortion to the product. Strength, we've noticed a significant increase in strength due to the way these are processed. I'm going to be speaking about this newer technology called the Ivotion disc, and this is a monolithic process, which even enhances the strength of this particular type of prosthesis even more. Excuse me, I'm just going to start a timer here. Okay. And uniform thickness is a very interesting side benefit of this particular process, because you could dial in the desired thickness of the denture base the machining of the process will give you exactly what you dial in. Now, not only does it give a uniformity of the contour, but it actually contours it to the underlying tissue contour. So whatever contours the patient has, of their palate, et cetera, it's going to reflect that same contour in the denture base. This is a very nice um, opportunity or uh, advantage for the patient because they have a feeling that they of comfort that the this contour follows with a familiar pattern in their mouth and they make comments like, "Gee, my digital dentures, they seem to kind of disappear in my mouth, or they feel like they grew in my mouth." They give very positive comments, and this is really regarding the reflection of the tissue contour in the way these denture bases are milled. So a very nice side benefit of this particular process. Of course, as a laboratory technician, a tremendous advantage to them is you could select the teeth and pretty much in a click we have at least what we refer to as a initial proposal of a setup. So these are set up by masters of removable prosthodontic technicians, and they did a beautiful job in setting up all these different arch forms of teeth, and they put them in the in very specific occlusal relationships. So it's a wonderful way to start the process, as opposed to the obviously, as you know, the traditional one tooth at a time with a wax spatula. Of course, the materials are industrially processed, and this really leads to a consistency of the product as opposed to individually processing things in a laboratory, which may or may not get the full benefit or the full physical properties of the product because of some inaccuracies, human error, and et cetera. So this is obviously a terrific advantage. How about clinical advantages? And I think it's fair, for a clinician to ask the question, kind of what's in it for us, and also the patient could ask that same question. This sounds interesting, and this new technology, doctor, but what does it do for me? And are there particular advantages? So let's take a look at some of them. The cast correction, when we take impressions and we pour up a model, and we always have little blebs here and artifacts there because it's just not a perfect science in taking impressions. Well, we could identify these blebs and perhaps little artifacts and whatever so much easier with this process because we could blow this up on our screen and we get great magnification and you could identify these little inaccuracies. And they got such terrific correction tools in this software. You got to quickly identify them, and with a click, you can remove them. Now, it's not only to make a prettier picture or a better looking cast or whatever, but it really does and may involve saving a sore spot or several sore spot adjustments. And because some of these blebs may actually turn into a uncomfortable feature inside the denture for the patient in these adjustments. So this cast correction is a wonderful opportunity for you to remove these artifacts. Prefabrication relief. And what I've heard to hear is that, and this is kind of philosophical, each of us has a little different way of perhaps looking at this, but this is an opportunity to kind of pre-adjust a denture. According to what I have realized when you look in the patient's mouth or you have a particular philosophy that you'd like to do. Mine is that I like to put a slight relief over the anterior or incisal papilla. And the median palatine raphe is usually very thin tissue, so I like to add a little relief. Now, typically, in a traditional technique, I would always remove a little bit of denture base prior to insertion in these particular areas, or put some pressure relief cream, try to identify where they're making contact in those areas. But here I have the opportunity to proactively make this slight relief. Again, when we're talking microns of material here, and plus I could identify little crevices and et cetera. Get that all relieved and eliminated so that you don't have these little knife edges and things that might cause irritation to the patient. And also, we could look at the labial surfaces of the ridges, areas that you anticipate where there's little undercut, where you're kind of anticipate where you may have some insertion issues or post-insertion adjustment issues. So this is again a very proactive way to do a pre-insertion adjustment of the denture basis. Tremendous opportunity. Now, of course, denture border extension is very important. And in our traditional technique, not only laboratories, but myself, when I process my own dentures, a little extra is good, a lot is better. So you're always filling in the sulcus, and it requires a lot of adjustment. And by doing so, not only could you harm the denture by adding heat to the denture and increasing the distortion of the denture, but it's a time-consuming and not a very you could take too much off or leave too much on. It's not a very predictable way of trimming the peripheral borders. With the digital technology, you could very easily read the borders much more accurately, blow this up to a very large size, and you as a clinician could participate with any of these proactive measures, with denture border extension, et cetera, by team viewing with the laboratory, or I think a lot of us have very good relationships with a dental technologist that you kind of read each other's mind after a while, and I think you have this conversation, and the graphics of the digital process is so great that you're going to be able to communicate to the laboratory how you like things and what your philosophy would be on how to fill these peripheral borders, how to read my impression, and et cetera. Or you could participate in these processes yourself personally. So a very, very interesting opportunity. Taking jaw records, as you know, as a clinician, is not an easy process for removable, and it's certainly not made any easier because we have to in the traditional technique with our denture bases, they need to be relieved so we don't cause damage to the master cast. So a lot of times these denture bases don't fit very well, and you're trying to take a very accurate jaw relationship with bases that are got movement to them and they're not very retentive, and it can be a real challenge. With the digital technology, you'll find that the bases that you're typically working with are fantastic. And in comparison, there is no comparison. And the outline of the bases, there's not this block out that you would have on these mastercast. Please don't get the relief mixed up with this block out. Totally two different subject matter here. So these digital bases you'll find to fit exquisitely well, and your opportunity to take more accurate jaw records is enhanced by many fold. Again, in our traditional process, we have a lot of error, processing error, grinding the denture base could cause error, as I mentioned. Um, just the shrinkage of the stone casts and how they're poured, the water powder ratio of the stone. So many things enter here where we typically have to compensate, especially in the posterior palatal seal area, with what we call a mechanical post dam by scratching a bead into the posterior part of the cast. It's scientific, but it's somewhat arbitrary how deep you make it and et cetera. And oftentimes we run into um, problems with doing this technique. I've been doing digital dentures for 5 to 7 years, somewhere in that range, and I have not done a post stamp. The accuracy is of such a quality, such a caliber that what the impression you take is exactly what you get back. So there's really no distortion. As I said, the accuracy is virtually zero. So we could avoid this mechanical post stamp. Um, Post-insertion occlusal abrasion. This is my stick, I guess. I've always been a stickler with my residents that the day we do an insertion is the day we do a clinical remount record before we give the patients the dentures to take home. Time consuming. However, we really can eliminate all the errors that were created throughout this whole process by doing this clinical remount and taking care of all those particular errors. Now, we have the opportunity again to proactively do an occlusal equilibration, and since there really is virtually no distortion of these denture bases, the accuracy of the equilibration, digital equilibration, is quite refined. And with a little bit of understanding of this process, you can certainly eliminate most times any need for a type of clinical remount procedure, and be very surprised at the day of insertion how accurately your bike registration is registered. Take home a try-in. The traditional try-in I always felt was a little bit rude to a patient to give them a hand mirror and tell them, do you like it? Don't you like it? Give you got 5 minutes to make a decision. And a lot of times the patients like to have the opportunity to take their try-in dentures home. As we're going to talk about the resin try-ins next appointment, next lecture. There's the opportunity with these resin try-in bases that we could give this to the patient to take home. There's no fear of anything, any teeth falling out or anything, and they have an opportunity to look in their mirror to give you some better feedback. So nice, very interesting opportunity. And of course, if the dog gets into the denture and destroys the denture, it's always a fear of a denture patient that they're going to lose their denture, misplace it, or as I said, having the dog jump into it. And this is a genuine fear. And gosh, if you could just well imagine how uncomfortable it would make you, thinking that someday you're going to wake up and boom, you don't have your denture, and now you got to go through that whole process again. And you could bet that the dentist, even though he's going to try really hard, is not going to be able to really make the same look that you had in that earlier denture. And that may be of great concern to you. The digital process, hands down, unbelievable, but you could save this information and literally remake the denture in exactly the same. And when you discuss this with the patient, you'll see a look of amazement that you could do that, doctor, and that gives a tremendous reassurance to the patient that God forbid something would happen, that they could not skip a beat and look exactly the same as they with the new denture as they did with their old denture. So a tremendous opportunity there. So all these wonderful things. So why the hesitation? A lot of reasons, real quickly. Maybe again, most of us haven't had this in our dental education. Schools are just starting to get on board with removable digital. And again, if you don't know what you don't know, if you don't think there's enough advantage to it, why bother? So there may be a perceived some wrong perceptions there. This is a good question about long-term success. Each of us should always be a cynic, and look at these new processes or maybe new materials, and have some hesitation because you don't know. Am I going to have an office full of these dentures come back with the dentures in the patient's hand all in all different parts, or they're stained black, or whatever it might be? I mean, it's right to be concerned about long-term success. You may have a disappointment with your local dental laboratory if they're not involved in this technology, and that's a hard one because you develop a great relationship with the lab, and it's hard to maybe have to deal with a new laboratory that's got the experience, and maybe you've tried something, maybe you tried one of these techniques and whatever and had a bad first experience, and that's unfortunate. I hope that we could stop that, and maybe next time you have a good experience. A lot of mixed messages. A lot of manufacturers are out there touting their wares, obviously, and there's some good, some bad. But it's hard to sort this out if you don't have the opportunity to try all these. But I'd say that probably the number one hesitation that I've had in conversations with my colleagues is, there's a certain intimidation about having to learn a new workflow or a new choice of materials or whatever, and it's hard. It's hard to make change and to that you haven't been introduced to this before. So anyway, we're going to tackle that next. So clinical workflows, very important, and we're going to ask the question, which is, do I have to learn any other, all these new techniques and everything else? For the most part, no. for the most part, the clinical workflows, and again, this entire program that I've put together here, I kept the I kept from getting into the technical weeds, and I'm a clinician. I'm approaching you as clinicians, and to try to give you the information that I think is essential for you to have as a clinician. And so we focus on these clinical workflows. I'll be very clinical, but the thing that I want you to get from each of these discussions on all these different workflows is what's key to each one of them is a attempt to communicate to the laboratory where to put the teeth. As simple as that. And we do this in our traditional technique, which we'll go over a little bit. But with the digital technology, sometimes we have much greater opportunities to make a much more accurate communication to the dental laboratory. So we'll go through each one of these individually. Now, there's a lot of different workflows. These I picked out as really the major workflows, and we'll take one at a time, and we'll go into detail with each one of these workflows. So the first we refer to as the traditional wax rim bite. So in other words, we are all familiar with the traditional 5-appointment type of procedure that most of us were taught in dental school, where you take preliminary impressions, you pour them up, you make your custom trays, take your final impressions, and go to the wax rim bite, and then wax try-in, and da-da-da. So this is a traditional technique. We could still do this and stop at the wax rim bite registration. And if we do that, we've captured a lot of information here, and the spirit of doing a wax rim is to guide the laboratory technician for the placement of teeth. So really, the labial position, the midline, the length of the incisors, obviously the centric relation, vertical dimension, all this is, this is the spirit of doing this wax rim, is to give the laboratory an accurate guide in which to set teeth. So we could start the digital process at this particular point. In other words, we have our traditional impressions. We poured up our cast, we made our denture bases, we did our traditional wax rim bite. Then from here, we could scan the casts and the bite registration. And then now we have a virtual mounting. And we also have a virtual representation of the wax rim, which is kind of nice, because now we could use that wax rim as a guide to set our occlusal plane. And let's think of the occlusal plane like a crosshair, because basically kind of what it is. It's our midline, and it's our occlusal plane. It's got this crosshair, and this could be shifted around and selected. And by having a wax rim that I could ghost in at any time, I could use this as the opportunity to help with the process of dictating where to set the teeth. Because as we set up this occlusal plane using the wax rim as our reference, we could then use this as a guide to set up our initial proposal for setting the teeth. Of course, we tweak it. We could do a lot of characterization and make little changes and things that we see. But primarily, this is an excellent means of communication to the design technician to where to start the initial proposal of setting the teeth. And then we could go to our fabrication of a resin try-in. By the way, this is a resin try-in, and I'll go into a little more detail next week as far as how we make these try-ins. But basically, this is a monolithic resin material that is pink is added on. It could be, a variety of materials from wax to whatever, just to give a little contrast between the teeth and the gingiva, make it a little more denture-like. It's not perfect, but it's a good rendition of a try-in, and we refer to this as our resin try-in. And then, of course, we go to our final dentures. So let's take a look at our screen, and this is what the laboratory technician is going to see when they do our scanning process. When we pop up and we ghost in our matrix, we use this as a guide to set our occlusal plane. And you can see the crosshair. And that says a lot. That says where our midline is. It says where our incisal length is. It kind of dictates the posterior occlusal plane as well. It dictates our bipupillary plane. So this is a ton of information that we are capturing. And now this is locked into the edentulous mounting. And then from here, a press of a button, and we could start with our initial proposal using this guidance of the initial setting of our occlusal plane. So I think you could see the value of communication. And in this particular workflow, the communication really is the wax rim. So let's give a couple of tips real quick. And with this particular technique, one thing is if you're doing traditional dentures, you really should have this very little tool, very inexpensive little tool that it can be heated, it can be used for left hand, right hand. That's why it's got these two different sleuth ways. It's got this hammerler fence, which is around 5 or 6 millimeters. And what it does, it rests into the hammerler notch area of the cast. And when heated up, you could adjust your wax rim very nicely, very, very evenly. And it does correlate to the bipupillary line with the hammerler notches. A lot of interesting science that goes into this. So it's a tool that you should have. The bite plane is just a simple amplification. You could call it a Fox plane if you like, but we're just something that we could rest onto the rim, so just to make sure that it's runs the occlusal plane that is running parallel to the bipupillary line. Very important communication to make on this wax rim. So having a bite plane or Fox plane, very important. All right, next clinical workflow. Impressions and bite in a denture. So this is my favorite. We could, probably the vast majority of patients walk into your office having a set of dentures. And not to take advantage of the fact that they have dentures is somewhat you're tying one hand behind your back. Why? Why not take advantage of it? So I'm especially with this technology, which I'll show, it really fits nicely into the digital denture technology, this particular workflow. Now, again, if a patient doesn't have a denture, then you can't do this workflow. We have another one that we'll talk about. But for the vast majority of patients, as we said, they enter in with an existing denture. You could certainly work from there. So this is a technique where we take impressions and a bite in their existing denture. If this is scanned, now this could be scanned using a lab scanner, which is typically done in a laboratory, and or you could do chairside. So if you have an intraoral scanner, you could certainly scan a denture. It only takes a minute or two to scan a denture with a little bit of practice, and then send the electronic file to the laboratory. A lot of advantage to this using an iOS because it controls infection control is very nice because you don't have to send anything to the laboratory and nothing goes out of the operatory. So infection control is very good. It's a nice convenience for the patient. Not to have not to be without their dentures for any period of time, and et cetera. So it's a very nice opportunity for you. But regardless of the way you scan it, it basically comes up and you have a virtual mounting. Again, with the teeth still in a representation where you could ghost them in or out at any time. Now, again, this is important because you're going to have the opportunity to look at these teeth and to make some determination of where you want the midline, where you want the incisal edges to be, the occlusal plane. You can make those judgments because you have a physical try-in that you could make these this information gathered from the patient, and then that transfers over to the design technician, and he has an idea of how to set the occlusal plane. So again, we could ghost this in at any time, and this will help guide the setting of the initial proposal of the setup. Again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of tweaking that goes on afterwards, but for the most part, this is a great way to start the process. And again, we go to a try-in and or a final denture. So again, let's take a look back, and we do our impressions in a denture, and we do our same type of evaluation as we did on the wax rim, right? We're going to look at this preset denture, and we're going to make determinations. I like the midline. I don't like the midline. I like the incisal length. I don't like the incisal length, and make certain recommendations. Now, I'm going to jump to another process, and we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about this, because what you're looking at here is a copy of the patient's denture, which I think is a better way to go. And I think this technology makes this a little bit easier for you to perform as well. So what we have here again is a copy of the patient's denture, a digital copy. Interesting. And again, same thing. We're going to look at this as we look at their denture in their mouth and make these determinations about all this various patient data. We mark it on a chart. This is a simple chart to record our midline, maxillary incisal edge, mandibular incisal edge, all the things that you should take note of. And you could grind on this. You could mark it with a pen. You could, however you want to communicate. This is a communication tool that you want to provide to the laboratory. So when this gets up on the screen, and in this particular patient, there was a line drawn, and that's how we followed for the bipupillary line, and there was information about the incisal edge, a little bit shorter than the other teeth, midline just over just a hair, whatever it was all. This is our tool to our reference to set up our occlusal plane. Again, we could remove or ghost in our denture at any given time. But again, this is going to set a proposal. Our initial proposal has an idea where to go according to this communication that you made via this denture that you took an impression in. Just a couple of tips. I'll go through them quickly. This is a lecture I gave many years ago, and what was kind of interesting about it is I spent a day in the dental laboratory and found that a lot of the impressions that came in, and I say this with all due respect, were a little less than ideal. A lot of overextension, underextension, and the bottom line is making edentulous impressions is not easy, especially when you're starting with a stock tray, which is like maybe an inch off in sometimes. And so it's no easy process to do. But my experience in the dental laboratory wasn't all negative, because the impressions that came into the laboratory that were made in duplicates of the patient's existing denture were by far the better impressions. Of course they were, because you're using basically a custom tray to make your impressions. And even a bad denture is better than a stock tray. So this always left an impression with me. No pun intended. But the typical way to duplicate a denture is a pain in the butt. This is a little duplicator here that you could add, silicone or alginate or whatever, and kind of duplicate the denture and put some raw PMMA material in there. But it's a bit of a pain, not very particularly accurate, and does have a lot of residual monomer if you're doing cold cure resin and stuff, so kind of distasteful. With the digital denture duplication, we do have another opportunity. Again, we start with taking the patient's existing denture, and if you don't have a iOS chairside scanner, then you could certainly make an arrangement with the laboratory where the patient stops in the lab, and the laboratory will scan their denture. But so the denture is scanned, and we call this a 360 scan in the sense that it takes the undersurface and the outer surface all in one. And 3Shape dental systems starting with their 19.3 upgrade, has given us the opportunity to do what we refer to as a copy denture. So a copy denture is two different opportunities. One is to literally copy a patient's denture by, and we could kind of split the file into teeth and tissue and manufacture the teeth separately and the base separately, bond these together, and literally give the patient a copy of their existing denture with this technology. So we call that the copy denture designed with teeth. We're going to use it a little differently for the other process. We refer to this as the copy denture monoblock. So this is what we're going to use as our custom trays. And it's a little simpler process, obviously. And so this process, again, could be milled or it could be printed. But what we do is, so to make our copy denture monoblock, we're going to scan our dentures, again, both surfaces. And as I said, several minutes really to do each of the dentures. And again, this could be done in the laboratory scanner or at the intraoral scanner chair side. And again, this file is given to the laboratory. They'll fabricate a monoblock try-in denture. And this could be made out of, could be milled, as I mentioned, or it could be printed. And probably printing is more economic way to do this process for try-in. And it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate because you're going to use this as impression trays. So we've taken this to the patient and we've used them as impression trays and a means to get a bite registration. So what we have is a copy of the patient's denture, which we used as impression trays. And then we were able to evaluate the teeth visually in the patient's mouth. We do that after the impressions in case there's any movement. And we make notations or grind this or add to it or mark it or whatever. And then finally, we take a new bite registration. And typically when I do a bite registration, I grind some of the lower posterior teeth to give myself a little thickness of bite registration material so that I don't have any interferences. So it's a nice way to do this process. Now, our copy denture technically now becomes with 3Shape is to use the 3Shape terminology, they now turns into a reference denture. Not a bad name, because as this is going to be scanned and placed up on the screen here, it's now going to act as a reference for us to set our occlusal plane according to how it was communicated from the clinician. So now we have our reference plane to start with. So let's go on to the next workflow. And we're going to come back to all these with a quick summary in a little bit. So the immediate dentures, this to me is one of the more viable techniques that you should be considering. And again, we could take our traditional impressions and bite registration. This can be lab scanned. These casts could be lab scanned. We have a virtual mounting. We could do virtual extractions. There's tools in the software to accommodate that. We could ghost in our pre-extracted teeth at any given time, again, to act as a reference to guide where we want to set our occlusal plane, which will then guide where we have our initial proposal of teeth, and then we make our final dentures. So we could also do a intraoral scan instead of doing traditional impressions, if that's your talent and your desire to learn this process. Is a very viable process to do an intraoral scan and then basically do the same sequence of events, just two different ways of getting the patient data scanned into the process. Again, we do a evaluation of the patient's existing teeth prior to extraction. Very important. I don't even care if there's one tooth in a patient's mouth. There's always some value that this could give. And we could determine from midline to length of teeth, and etc. Very important information that's provided. So we pop it up on the screen, and we could also now, pay attention and set our occlusal planes again according to what was evaluated by the clinician chair side, looking at the patient's teeth prior to extraction. And again, this will set up a occlusal plane where we could then position our initial proposal of denture tooth setting as accordingly. Couple of quick tips. Taking impressions for immediate dentures is always a bit of a challenge. I've, last 5 years ago, whatever, I kind of bumped into this material. It's a virtual putty material. It's a impression material, but it's a putty form, and I just love it for taking immediate denture impressions because it has body to it, and anything else, even heavy body material that comes out of a carcolite, just doesn't have the I come out of a cartridge, just doesn't have the body, most times to really record the peripheral borders. So I find these putty materials work so much better, and if you could take some of the excess material off, if you so desire, you could put a light body wash in it. It even better accurize the process of this technique. Obviously, if your teeth are quite mobile, you may not want to do this process with this material, but I do like a two-phase alginate material if possible, so I can inject where the teeth are and then have a heavier body in the base and take a two-phase impression with alginate. Alginate is obviously an excellent material, but it's harder to take impressions with compared to the putty material. Also, very becoming more and more popular, and I think will, become the most popular technique is taking impressions with, don't take impressions, using the intraoral scanning process. So again, this is just going to take a little learning curve, but certainly clinicians are finding great value in doing the scans intraorally. And you may need a surgical guide. And if you're doing a lot of alveolectomy, I certainly recommend a surgical guide. All right, last and probably the most challenging is going to be the direct to try-in. Again, this is kind of where we're starting because we don't have a denture to work with, or we don't have extracted teeth, or we don't have wax rims or whatever. So if you look back at the three techniques we just described, each of them had a reference. The wax, rim bite, we had the wax rim as a reference. Impressions of bite in the denture, we had the reference denture concept. Immediate dentures, we had, teeth that we had as a reference. But the direct to try-in is where we have a situation where we have to start from scratch. As I said, I think a very small number of patients, percentage-wise, come in without a denture, but when they do, we need an alternative. Here we'll do traditional impressions using, obviously, stock trays, and there's a little suggestion down the road. Probably this is the one clinical technique that does require some learning of a new technique, not much, but a little bit. And this is referred to as a centric tray to get a bite registration. And the other is what referred to as a UTS CAD to get some occlusal plane information. These are scanned, so now we got our virtual mounting. And again, we set our occlusal plane, which we'll discuss in a sec. And then I guess initially, at least, we used to think about setting rims, but we think more about this, like why? And so let's just jump and use our centric tray information, our UTS CAD information, and we could literally jump to a process of designing a denture and setting teeth. So our next appointment could be a try-in instead of a rim stage. So that's where we got the terminology. It's a direct to try-in. So you've avoided the rim stage with this technology. And again, we go to a final denture. So let's take a look at why. Would you rather look at a amorphous rim, or would you like to look at tooth forms? It's obvious, the try-in with the tooth forms just provides you the opportunity to have such a better perception of where to put teeth and et cetera. So this certainly wins the day for the try-in. Um, so, we got different options for impressions. As I mentioned, we could take alginate, we could take a putty material, and we could trim off the putty and do a putty and wash material, or you could do an intraoral scanning, which is, for the edentulous mouth, a bit of a challenge for me on a personal note. I have a lot of challenge with the mandibular arch, and for the maxillary arch, I think most of you might be rather successful. But again, it's great technology, and it's up to the talent and the desire of the clinician. Centric tray, very briefly, we use a putty-like material, our virtual putty material. We load this up. This is just provides like a scaffold to get a mush bite. It's kind of a glorified mush bite because we need a inter-arch relationship. Doesn't have to be pretty, just needs to have some contacting surfaces. And so we could pin this together and get a virtual mounting. The UTS CAD is not a FACEBO, but it positions itself to the centric tray, placed back into the patient's mouth, and really gives us a number, which we could then add to the design process, which will, in this case, the bipupillary plane, it kind of gives that patient data to the computer, and also the sagittal plane, which we set it up to the ala tragus line. I'm going to go briefly on this because there's more information you can get from the company, which I'll mention in a minute. So this information is not, again, the UTS is not transferred to the laboratory, only the numbers. And this is the instructions for use that you could obtain from the from Ivoclar VivaNet, which give a little more detail on these two tools. So here we are virtually. Here's our centric tray. We take the centric tray off, and it allows us to have a virtual mounting because we need that relationship, a inter-arch relationship. We then add in our information that we've gathered from the UTS CAD, and this provides our posterior occlusal plane. This is our bipupillary. This is our anterior occlusal plane. It's setting. And if we use a tool like a pupillometer, or we average value the length of the incisal teeth, if there's no other information, that's going to be our starting point as far as a occlusal plane. And then from here, we could use this as our guide for the initial proposal of teeth. So it's a little bit more challenging because we don't have a reference, but that's why we had to add the tools of the centric tray and the UTS CAD. So that kind of concludes our program for today. Very quick summary: we discussed the technical advantages, and there are many. And as you saw, that there was great opportunity to technically make a better denture with this technology. We looked at the clinical advantages for the clinician and patient, and we're able to certainly extract a lot of potential advantages for patient and clinician. We discussed a little bit about the hesitations, and we felt that probably learning a new workflow is probably the greatest among these hesitations. And we did track through all the different clinical workflows, emphasizing that the traditional wax rim bite, the impressions of bite and dentures, immediate dentures, those three workflows used have references in which you could use to help communicate. The direct to try-in, starting from scratch, is always going to be your greater challenge. We had to introduce a couple of tools there to the centric tray and a UTS CAD to kind of facilitate starting from scratch. So that's where we are at the end of today's session. And for next week, we're going to look into the prescription. Important to understand the different manufacturing processes that you have available. The tooth selection, kind of neat to look at tooth selection in a totally different way. And just a brief thing on communication tools and the prescription form. The clinical try-in, we're going to emphasize a little bit because that's going to be your greater challenge, I think, to understand. And obviously the bottom line is what can you expect the day of insertion? So At this point, I want to thank each of you for attending. I hope you share some of the passion that I have, for this new technology. It's unbelievable. If you haven't had the opportunity or to go forward or to challenge yourself, please go pick one of these workflows. The impression of the denture one, I think, is a slam dunk in immediate dentures. That just makes common sense to me to want to go in those directions. Choose your laboratory, discuss it with the laboratory. This is a partnership that you must have, and I think you'll enjoy tremendous success. So from this, I'm going to go forward and see if there's any questions from the group here. I went over just a little bit, I think. But question here, Frank, how do you duplicate a patient's existing dentures? Would be your approach? As I said, I don't like doing the traditional duplication. It's clumsy, it's stinky, it's undesirable. It's good that you take impressions with a duplicate of the patient's denture, but the denture, as I kind of mentioned in the program there, the opportunity to do a intraoral scan, using a intraoral scanner chairside and scanning the patient's existing denture. The Trio scanner does a fine job in doing that. And from my friends that I've talked with, the learning curve is rather short. If you're already using your iOS to scan crown and bridge, and most of you probably are, the trying to scan a denture is kind of a piece of cake. And then by doing that, again, as I said, you control the infection control, keeping the denture in the operatory. You're not touching the patient's existing denture. And that's then you don't have to worry about putting denture adhesive in the denture. You could grind the copy denture. So many advantages to that particular process. So and I don't know the costs. Obviously, there's a cost associated with having a copy denture, but I think the time that it saves you chairside, having a built-in custom tray technique is far outweighs whatever cost it might be. So hopefully I answered that particular question. A nice compliment from somebody, so I'll just skip through that. How long do the dentures last? I guess that's the question. Well, I'm going to get into this with the manufacturing options. One of the important things to look at is, and again, I kind of mentioned in the hesitations, if there's questions about long-term success, that's a legitimate question and something that you have to consider. So there's a lot of different manufacturing options and materials. Personally, again, I know Ivoclar Vivadent is sponsored this particular program, but I'm all in when it comes to using materials that have been time tested and I'm familiar with. And I kind of look at the products of this particular system, with the iVotion system in particular, is the fact that they use familiar materials, just that they've optimized the manufacturing process. So as far as expectations are exactly, as far as longevity and whatever, they're certainly the same, or I think much better, especially with the monolithic process that we'll get into next week, because there's no interface and no teeth popping out, and stronger denture, less chance of likelihood of fracture, and the accuracy is much better. And there's just tons of good feelings I have here concerning the process. So how long they'll last, I think you're going to be can be a very, very acceptable longevity. It says, do you have any tips for making smash bites? Haven't heard that term for edentulous without dentures and without that mounting device. The mounting device I showed you, it's only a scaffold. You could take a mush bite with anything. You could use beeswax. You could use just a putty all by itself without the centric tray. Anything that's going to give you a reasonable inter-arch relationship, because you only need a little bit of impressioning of the tissue surface on the upper and the lower, and then that can be pinned, technically pinned to the impressions. So you could kind of make a mounting using really any choice of material. So a centric tray is nice, but you could, if you got a better way of doing a smash bite or a mush bite, then certainly you could do it. But because you'll scan both of those and it will work. It will work. You'll get at least in the mounting process. I think that's about most of the questions we could. Oh, no, take that back. Oops. Okay. Can dentures be relined if the fit is less than ideal? Of course. Again, goes back to the choice of materials that you're using. With this particular system, we're using polymethylmethacrylate material basis. So any kind of reline or temporary relines and things, all this would be all very traditional to your typical technique. A lot of very nice compliments, by the way. Thank you, everybody, for those. Lab recommendation, 3D printer recommendation. I guess you kind of, for doing interim procedures like I'm talking about here for the copy denture, reference denture type of thing, try-in dentures. Gosh, you could use the cheapest printer. I mean, I know, and they're fine, because I'm not looking for perfect accuracy or anything, because I'm typically using these as impression trays, and the accuracy is quite good enough. Let's put it that way, for these interim procedures. So you don't really have to spend a lot on a printer to do these interim type procedures. Is there any type of scanner I won't. I can't speak from great experience here, but I've had others call in. The question is there only one type of scanner for dentures, or will iTero scanner capture the scans? To be honest with you, I'm not trying to promote one over the other, but I've had comments that the iTero scanner didn't do very well trying to scan dentures, and I don't know because I haven't tried it myself personally. I can certainly say the 3Shape or the Trio scanner does a fine job in scanning the dentures, but they kind of just will share that comment with you. Hey, Frank, how much does the digital denture cost as compared to the traditional ones? Each laboratory is going to be obviously different, but it seems to be a very comparable cost. I am very pleased to say that I think most laboratories will have a comparable cost. Again, it's all up to the individual pricing of the laboratories. But as far as I see, especially with the monolithic disc that we'll talk about next week, it does seem to give us an opportunity to keep the cost down and for a very, very quality type denture. I think we have to probably call it quits. We almost there. No, a couple of minutes, maybe stuck in a few more. Do any of the procedures change for patients with nervous disorders and or systemic diseases? No, I mean, it's clinical common sense. If you have a challenging patient, I think one of the nice things with this, with the workflow options, you might be able to facilitate and speed up some of the processes with the patient. I think with a nervous disorder, maybe intraoral scanning may not be a very good option because you'll never be able to keep the patient still long enough. But these putty materials, I think, are very nice for taking impressions because there's kind of an in and out, can be relatively quick procedure and kind because it doesn't flow down to patients. Doesn't have the potential to flow down their throat and things. So it's just, different common sense procedures that you may want to try. Again, a lot of compliments. I appreciate it. And does this mean that digital dentures will not need denture teeth? Well, that's interesting. Well, we're going to get into next week denture tooth selection. And please, hopefully you'll be there for that because that's a lot of information to discuss. And so there's a lot of manufacturing options where we can use carded denture teeth as part of the process, or we could use a milled arch of teeth as the process, or we could use a monolithic process, which we'll talk about. But I'm going to save that discussion for next week, and hopefully that'll give you reason to come again. So again, I will drop off here, and again say thank you to everybody. I so appreciate the opportunity to share this information. As I said, hopefully I passed on just a little bit of the excitement and maybe got you over the hump of being uh, hesitant. Communicate with the laboratory of your choice, and I think that might be a big part of the of your to remove your hesitation, to have a good laboratory relationship, and listen to their guidance, and continue going to these programs. I think you can get a lot out of it.